The basic argument is that many communication programs, many social marketing programs, particularly communication programs, have focused on providing knowledge, providing ideas, on the assumption that that's all it took to get people to change. They learn something new. That's a good idea. I'll do it. And of course, that rarely works. People are really rarely in that situation. And so you can contrast two models of effect. One is a model which says, I tell them, they learn it, they do it. And the other is to say that behaviors are well ensconced. They've got lots of supports, lots of reasons why people do them. And if you want to get behavior change, it's going to take a long time. At a simple level, it's just the amount of exposure that a program achieves. There's the number of times the message is heard and through lots of channels. So it's making lots of noise means getting repeated exposure to your messages. The program noise says it's an important issue. You really ought to pay attention to this. You hear it lots of times from lots of sources, and maybe at some point you begin to think it's true. And that's really the argument for program noise, is when you have a situation where new knowledge isn't enough, but you really need to change social norms, you really need to change the way people think about it, get people to pay more attention to an issue, then that's the point at which repeated exposure may really matter. There's another argument for exposure, though, as well, which is our audiences are constantly changing. Think about the problem of immunization. Or people need to know about kids' immunization when their kids are of the age to be immunized. But every 6 months, there are a whole bunch of new kids that are born. If you do it just once, you're not likely to reach those audiences as they begin to come of age. One of the things that multiple exposures may do is engender more social discussion. That is, you hear it, I don't, but because you hear it repeatedly, you say, this must be an important issue. I'll make it a topic of my social discussion. I'll talk about smoking, or I'll talk about AIDS. Maybe if you heard it only rarely, you might not want to talk about it publicly. It doesn't become okay. I think that's been really important for HIV. That is, it became acceptable to talk about condoms in public, which in earlier periods simply wasn't. And so the fact of repetition legitimates talk about something, which probably wouldn't come from single exposures, even if people were convinced about the truth of it. I think the issue is that most programs fail when they fail, not because their messages are bad or they didn't understand their environment so well, so they never got enough exposure to matter. That is, they said, we'll get this on the air because they'll give us contributed time, and nobody ever sees the message. In my experience, it's probably the best single predictor whether a program is successful or not. That is, how much exposure it got. And in fact, I've looked at a whole range of programs, and I think many of the well-known programs that have not been so successful have largely been not successful because they just didn't get enough exposure to matter. Given the background noise that was already there, they didn't add anything new. So one argument for measuring exposure is that it's the area of failure most often. And so really knowing whether or not you're actually getting to the audience, whether they recognize your message, whether they remember it or not, seems to be an absolute minimum condition for deciding a program is going to work. And lots of times it doesn't for just that reason. There are whole classes of evaluation methods which are helped by being able to show that those who were exposed compared to those who were not exposed were showing the outcome that you wanted. That is, they're more likely to breastfeed if that's what you're going after, or they're more likely to do physical activity than if that's what you're going after, than people who were not so exposed. And although there are some problems with trying to evaluate things with simple associations between exposure and outcome, still there are good statistical methods for trying to control for possible other characteristics that might have mattered. So being able to show not only how much exposure you got, which is a minimum condition for a successful program, but also trying to show that exposure is associated both with intermediate outcomes, mediating things like changes of knowledge, but also associated with behavior change in the end, is a real important thing. So I think exposure is a crucial thing to measure and to do seriously. In terms of how to measure exposure, there's a whole range of good methods. I think there are some methods which you can use which are independent of the individual's reports, that is, rating points, for example, or other sorts of external measures of how much exposure was achieved. But then there are lots of ways of measuring it directly with people. The most common ways certainly are asking people if they recall specific messages, again, trying to make sure that they are not just making it up, that they're not claiming exposure when they really didn't get it. Typical way is to ask about false messages as well as true messages, and sort of correct for the fact that some people remember false messages. If you're operating under the model which says this is behavior that's well ensconced, that's behavior that people have been doing for a while, that's not going to be so easy to change, you have to have quite reasonable expectations about how fast it's going to change relative to the amount of exposure you're providing. And so at some level, while there's not a direct trade-off with every additional ad, you're going to get that much more change, still there's an argument which says for behaviors that are hard to change, that are that people hold dear, it's going to take a long time. So I guess the real important issue in terms of evaluation, when you think about a program noise model, what you're really saying is you're assuming that this is going to be a hard behavior to change. You're going to have to do lots of things, go through lots of channels, which means you need to have a reasonable expectation for how long it's going to take to get all those channels working, to get institutions to change, to get social networks to operate, to try to say this is a new behavior. That's not going to happen instantly, and therefore probably the most important thing is to have patience. I realize often funders don't have patience. That is, they have very quick expectations. But typically with a program that has this model underpinning it, you have to expect slow change. Think about the smoking interventions. It's true that there's some decent evidence over a couple of years for Florida for the national campaign suggesting they've had effects. But in some level, if you go back to the extraordinary decline in smoking behavior that's present in the United States, it happened at the rate of 1.5%, 2% a year. Many evaluations wouldn't even be able to detect that change with extremely large samples. But yet, that was really a social movement change. It took a long time to take place. It had lots of aspects that were changing, but eventually it did produce a very substantial change. You have to be ready to wait.